Podiums then. We've ridden them, but we haven't really drilled down into what actually makes them so good. I've seen a bit of a smear campaign on these forks, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's due to them just being an expensive fork that's gonna harbour some hate. But I've seen quite a lot of unscientific tests showing the stiction of the fork without any of the internals in. There's too much stiction in the fork. Having the weight of the wheel drop, putting the legs on a flat surface and they do this and stuff. It's just all nonsense. None of them are doing the axle up correctly. None of them are actually testing the fork as a full system with everything bolted together with the correct axle tightening procedure, which is a thing on these forks. It is a bit fiddly. You do have to do it to get the fork completely parallel. And most of the beef is around the bushing friction, but they're brand new. They do need to wear in. If you're expecting the perfect bushing tolerance out of the box, it's not going to happen. If you had that, your bushes would wear prematurely and you'd end up with play in the fork. So there is this fine balance that manufacturers have to take in terms of tolerance. They need tight enough tolerance that it lasts a good time, so the service intervals are good, but they still want good performance. You can play around with it, so you can go more towards performance, in which case, come to us and we'll size your bushes with our sizing tool. In which case, you're going to get a much smoother fork, way less friction, but your bushes are going to wear out quicker. So there's always a trade-off. Out the box, however, the fork's pretty smooth, feels great. I haven't seen any issues or experienced any issues with stiction. They feel far, far smoother. The bushing overlap in the fork itself is much, much bigger than any other fork on the market. So mid-stroke and under big compressions, there's less flex in the fork. They don't bind up in the middle of their travel. So I just wanted to call out this sort of wave of negative sentiment against the fork online. And this goes for all upside down forks as well. Once we've got past that, let's look at what actually makes them exquisitely good. And we've stripped it down. My first initial thoughts are around how high the quality is of all the components. Everything is spectacular, to the point where it seems frivolous, really. Some bits are anodised purple, some bits are anodised blue. So let's go through the fork. I guess the first bit to talk about is what we would call a crown steerer unit. Is an absolute beast. They're super chunky, I think 54mm diameter, with a 38mm stanchion that runs in them. Super, super stiff, incredibly nice engineering. And what we need to take into account with the cost of making this part is that this isn't a mass-produced fork. This is a limited run of forks, and this particular part, this crown steerer unit, isn't used across 5 or 6 different models of fork. Whereas on the 36, the 38, the 34, the moulds, the presses, the extrusions that they produce to make these forks can be used across multiple models, whereas this is just one model. And it's the first year out and the first time they've used those castings and things. So that particular piece there is, I would probably say, is going to be the most expensive bit to make. It's most of the structure of the fork. It's the heaviest bit. It's not very light, but it's the bit that sets up the chassis stiffness of the fork, which ultimately brings you on to the performance of the fork. We talked about the bushing overlap, much, much bigger than on any other fork on the market. And what that means is just when you're loading the fork, if you watch some slow-mo videos of forks or normal regular forks, they compress, there's a flex moment, they receive some stiction, so the bushes hang on to the fork, it decelerates, and then that stiction gets relieved again when the flex moment finishes and the fork carries on accelerating. So there's always this acceleration, deceleration, acceleration phase on compression. These don't do that. So when you're really pushing into things, they just feel perfectly smooth all the way through their travel. There's no spike, there's no weird grip change, because that can happen on the other forks. There's a bit of a grip change where that flex is causing the fork to decelerate. These don't do it. They're super, super stiff for that. And I know there's lots of talk about torsional stiffness, but really Fox have done lots and lots and lots of testing, especially with this axle, to make sure that the torsional stiffness is perfect. It's not too little and it's not too much. I think they tested over 20 different axles and ended up with this steel axle. In that respect, the chassis of the fork is fully optimized, and I can vouch for how good they feel. Very, very similar feeling to a Fox 38, except you don't have this binding moment. And they just feel super smooth. So that's the first part of the chassis. Phenomenal bit of kit, and it looks quite sick as well. Next up, we've got the stanchions, the legs. These are pretty standard stuff, to be honest. And I would imagine Fox have got these lying around. Lots of them, the same tube as a 38mm. Obviously a different mounting at the other end. It's not attached to the crown steer unit. This is attached to the axle clamp, but pretty standard stuff. Straight tube, Kashima coating, molybdenum disulfide coating, which helps to fill in the micro pores in between the regular anodizing, just making the surface a bit smoother. Really only makes a big difference at high speed or when the fork's hot, but it looks sick and everyone likes Kashima. So I've talked a little bit about the axle being steel and a little bit about making sure people tighten up the axle correctly. It is a floating axle. The only difference is you've got a clamp on both sides. So you need to nip up the axle, clamp one side, let the other leg float a little bit, so give it a tap, make sure it's aligned. And for me personally, I pull the handlebars in about 10mm, 20mm, just so everything settles down and aligns. Then I tighten the axle. So there's a little bit of faff with this, but this is a premium fork for ultimate performance, and I'm more than happy to do that every time I take the front wheel out. That's absolutely fine for me because I get the best performance fork. If you don't want to go through that faff, buy a 38. But if you want the smoothest fork possible, buy this and do the fork axle up the right way. Anyway, what else is different? I guess let's start with main event for me, which is the air spring. It's got a different top cap, which is very cool, and different volume spacers. So the volume spacers on Fox used to click in sideways, whereas this kind of has like a little finger and you sort of load the volume spacers up like that. Really nice system. And of course, because they're not up this way, these aren't going to fall off or anything like that. They're quite a tight fit. The one thing I did find when I took them apart was that there was a little bit too much lubricant in here. And I did find that it was purging out of the air valve every time I put the pump on. And it's on the disc side. So little bit of a weird design choice there from Fox. I understand that's to make the fork consistent with all their models, but the air valve is right next to your disc. So I would have liked to have seen them kind of optimize that really and put it on the drive side. The other end of the air spring then is this, which is a beautiful looking thing. It's so well engineered, and it's purple, which makes it cool. It's one of the smoothest feeling seal heads I've ever had the pleasure of feeling. It's got massively overbuilt sealing. It's got a double seal here. Usually you only see one seal on these seal heads. And the main event at the top here is what they call glide core. Now, this is kind of similar to Buttercups in RockShox. Buttercups is more like a vibration damping thing, whereas this is more of a way of getting rid of any binding in the fork mid-travel. So that if you are mid-corner really pushing in and the fork receives some flex, this moves and the piston stays completely parallel and can move up and down the stanchion completely smoothly, no drag, no binding, and you get a super, super smooth fork. So that is one of my favorite bits of this fork, glide core. That does come in the 38s as well, but in this fork in particular, it's definitely noticeable how smooth that is. So the damper side of the fork is the new Grip X2 damper, which you'll find in this and the Fox 38. And it's been massively refined over the Grip X and even the Grip 2, especially over the Grip 2. Features high speed and low speed compression, high speed and low speed rebound, but there's some other stuff going on in this damper that maybe other dampers don't really have. So let's have a quick look at that. Comes in a cartridge, so you can take the whole thing out your fork if you want to. Makes servicing a little bit easier. You've got compression on the top of the fork and rebound on the bottom, as you normally would. The compression valve assembly itself is spring-backed IFP. So this sits in the tube with the fluid up against this O-ring, and then this spring compresses as the suspension compresses and just allows the fluid to displace. The reason for that is it stops damper spikes. Even though the fluid technically is a column of fluid and the piston flows through it, not the fluid flowing through the piston, if that makes sense, you still need somewhere for that fluid to go in an instance where you get a really high speed impact and the pressure's too great in the damper system. You need some way for the fluid to be able to displace, because the only way you can apply damping is if the fluid is able to move. So that's what that does. It also applies a little bit of pressure to the fluid as well, which helps with sort of equalize high pressure and low pressure instances around the damper. That all gets very technical, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But that is pretty simple stuff from Fox, to be honest. It's really nice to see Fox go back to basics when it comes to dampers. They went through a period of having very, very complex damper shim arrangements, and this is just a really nice, simple compression damper. Super well made, super smooth. Everything is just, when you move anything on this fork, it's all super smooth and nice. There's no snagging, and it's purple and blue, which is obviously cool. The other side of the damper is rebound, which is in here. That's this part here. So this is your seal head that stays still in the damper, and this piston rod moves up and down attached to the stanchion in this particular fork. Moves up and down in a column of fluid that's in this damper. We've got a similar arrangement. We've got a great big long needle goes through the middle of the damper, and you can meter that, so you can change the resistance by adjusting the adjuster. That advances or retards that needle in these orifices and creates more or less low speed rebound restriction. The high speed is all through shims, again, much like the compression. So at some point in the speed of the return of the fork, there's going to be a point where volume of fluid that the low speed orifice can deal with is too much. It needs some other way to displace. So it opens these high speed shims here. But if you look at damper curves, you'll see a low speed to high speed change. There's usually this shoulder in the force where the shims pop open, and there's this kind of section in the travel where it's not high speed, it's not low speed, it's a bit of both, and it can be quite a harsh change in the fork. That can create all sorts of problems for your fork and performance, damper spikes, big variances in low pressure and high pressure inside the fork, which can create extra heat. You can actually heat the shims enough to temper them. You can see how hot the shims have got from this flapping, this opening and closing of the shims. So what Fox have done here is they've created something called VVC, Variable Valve Control. And that's this extra stack on top of the high speed here that just smooths that out. It's a secondary shim stack or mid valve that is the go-between damping system between low speed and high speed. So when there's a point where the high speed shims need to open, the VVC will also open and smooth that transition. So that's quite a unique thing to Fox, this VVC system, which is all quite technical. There's lots of stuff out there if you really want to get into it, but all you need to know is that damper there is a work of art. That's absolutely incredible. That for me is one of the best bits of this fork, and it's one of the best rebound dampers I've ever ridden. For me, the fork, I've been able to ride it in the middle of the adjusters, and it's kind of perfect. I'm about 80 kilos, and I'm perfectly in the middle for most stuff. There's other cool bits. You get carbon fibre mud guards, which is pretty cool. Make the fork look super motocrossy. You get the normal adjusters. The adjusters on this fork are actually really nice to use. They're big, they're quite smooth, they're easy to turn, and all the usual Fox quality. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of what's going on in these forks. I said it was a hyper fork, and I do agree with that. Every little component in this fork is perfect, perfectly engineered, perfectly finished, perfect tolerances. It rides incredible. And just knowing that this is what you're buying this right at cutting edge technology that's not only very well made and super high quality, it's serviceable, it works really well, and it looks flipping sick. It's the best fork. And I love suspension stuff, so this stuff just gets me going. Podium fork stripped down. There we go.